My first night on the job, the town's siren wailed even though the schedule said it wouldn't. The sound rolled over the empty parking lot and into the store like wind through a grave. In cosmetics, the glass counter showed my reflection and someone else standing behind me, too tall, too thin, like a person stretched by a bad dream. When I turned, I was alone. The air smelled like old flowers and cold pennies. They say if you spend time at Edinburgh Manor, the cold follows you home. I've never been there. But at 1 a.m, the heat in our store shut off by itself, and I watched my breath bleed white in the camera feed. Something moved in aisle 19. It didn't set off a sensor. It just leaned around the end cap and waited for me to notice. 3 months ago, I was teaching history at Cedar Falls High School. Had a wife named Jenny, a mortgage on a split level near the Winnebago River, and a 10-year plan that included coaching baseball and maybe adopting a dog. Then Jenny's Buick hit black ice on Highway 218, spun across both lanes, and wrapped around an oak tree older than the state itself. The paramedics said she died on impact. I said thank you like they'd handed me groceries. The insurance money ran out fast. Grief counseling in Waterloo costs more than most people make in a week, and I discovered that sleeping pills and bourbon don't mix well with substitute teaching. The school board suggested I take some time to process. Translation: they fired me after I showed up to work still drunk and tried to teach sophomore world history using nothing but Wikipedia articles about the Black Death. My brother Dale found me sleeping in my car outside the old Hy-Vee on Annsboro. He dragged me 2 hours south to Marion, Iowa, population 41,000 and shrinking. The town sits in the shadow of Cedar Rapids like a forgotten suburb, full of strip malls and cornfields that stretch to the horizon. Dale knew a guy who knew a guy who managed the Hawkeye department store on Highway 151. They needed overnight security, minimum wage, health insurance after 6 months, and all the coffee I could drink from the employee break room. Easy money, Dale said. Place has been there since the 70s. Nothing ever happens except the occasional shoplifter during the day. The manager, a soft-spoken woman named Beth Kohler, walked me through the store during my interview. 37 aisles of clothing, electronics, groceries, and seasonal merchandise. Standard retail layout with wide corridors and decent lighting. The security office sat in the back corner, surrounded by monitors showing feeds from 42 cameras scattered throughout the building. Mostly you just walk the perimeter every hour and watch the screens, Beth explained. We've had some break-ins lately. Kids, probably, but corporate wants someone here overnight just in case. She handed me a laminated card with 7 rules typed in Arial font. Simple stuff. Lock the doors, test the alarms, call the police if anything seemed off. What she didn't mention was how the cameras sometimes showed things that weren't there when you walked the actual aisles. Beth handed me the keys on a ring shaped like Iowa's state outline. Heavy brass keys that looked older than the store itself, worn smooth by decades of hands. The parking lot emptied as the last customer drove away in a dented Ford pickup, tail lights disappearing into the November darkness. Corporate requires these protocols, she said, tapping the laminated card. Been the same rules for 20 years, ever since the previous security guard quit without notice. Follow them exactly, no exceptions. I read through the list while she gathered her purse and jacket. Rule 1. Lock all entrances by 10:15 p.m. The main door lock requires 3 full turns clockwise. Rule 2. Test fire alarms in sections A, D, and G only. Never test the alarm in section C. Rule 3. During hourly patrols, avoid aisle 19 between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Rule 4. If the store's landline rings, answer only after the fourth ring. State your name and position clearly. Rule 5. The break room coffee maker turns on automatically at 2:30 a.m. Do not drink the first pot. Rule 6. If any customer is found inside after closing, escort them to the main entrance immediately. Do not engage in conversation. Rule 7. Emergency exits must remain unlocked from the inside. Check these doors every hour, but never open them to look outside. Some of these seem odd, I said. What's wrong with aisle 19? Beth's expression tightened. She checked her watch, a silver Timex that caught the overhead lights. Inventory issues. Boxes fall over, merchandise gets scattered. Easier to avoid the hassle during restocking hours. And the coffee maker? Old machine. First brew tastes like rust. She paused at the main entrance, fishing for her car keys. Dale mentioned you've had a rough few months. This job is perfect for getting back on your feet. Quiet, routine, no stress. After she left, I locked the main door according to Rule 1. 3 full turns clockwise, just as specified. The bolt slid home with a solid thunk that echoed through the empty store. The silence that followed felt thick, like water in my ears. The security office smelled like stale cigarettes and burnt coffee. A folding chair sat before a bank of monitors, each screen cycling through different camera angles. I recognized the layout from my afternoon tour. Electronics, clothing, groceries, pharmacy. The timestamp read 10:47 p.m. My first patrol went smoothly. I walked the perimeter, checking that emergency exits remained unlocked, while making sure no one lurked behind the customer service desk or in the fitting rooms. The store felt different at night. Larger somehow, with spaces that seemed to stretch beyond what I remembered from the daylight hours. Around 11:30, I tested the fire alarms in sections A, D, and G. Each chirped once when I pressed the red button, confirming functionality. I avoided section C entirely, though I noticed it housed aisle 19 and the adjacent cosmetics department. The landline rang at 12:14 a.m. I let it ring 4 times before answering. This is David Mueller, overnight security at Hawkeye Department Store. Static crackled through the earpiece. In the background, I heard what sounded like wind through bare branches, or maybe paper rustling in an empty room. Hello? I said again. The line went dead. At 1 a.m. sharp, I began my second patrol. Following Rule 3, I planned my route to bypass aisle 19 completely. But as I walked through electronics, something caught my peripheral vision. On monitor 7, the camera covering aisle 19, a figure stood near the end cap display. If you like the stories, please hype the videos from a button like this just above the comment section. They helps the videos to get more reach and perform well. It would take just a few seconds and cost nothing, but would help the channel grow even faster. Thank you. I stopped walking. The figure remained motionless, positioned between shelves of cleaning supplies and paper goods. Too tall for the space, shoulders hunched forward like someone trying to fit through a doorway built for shorter people. I checked the other monitors. Every other camera showed empty aisles and darkened sections. Only monitor 7 displayed this visitor who shouldn't exist in a locked building. My training said to investigate. Common sense said to call the police. Rule 3 said to stay away from aisle 19. I chose the rules. But when I returned to the security office 10 minutes later, monitor 7 showed nothing but empty shelving and fluorescent fixtures humming their electric song. The store's heating system kicked on at 1:47 a.m., filling the silence with mechanical groans and the whisper of air through vents. I'd been staring at the monitors for 30 minutes, watching empty aisles and waiting for that tall figure to reappear. My coffee had gone cold in a styrofoam cup, emblazoned with the Hawkeye logo, a cartoonish bird that looked friendlier in daylight. Every few minutes, I glanced at Mometer 7. Aisle 19 remained vacant except for scattered merchandise and price tags that fluttered whenever the air conditioning cycled on. But the longer I watched, the more I noticed things that didn't belong. A box of laundry detergent turned backward on the shelf, showing only its plain cardboard backing. A shopping cart positioned sideways across the aisle, its wheels perfectly aligned despite no one being there to place it. The landline rang again at 2:03 a.m. 4 rings. I counted each one. David Miller, overnight security. This time, instead of stonic, I heard breathing. Slow and measured, like someone recovering from a long run. In the background, something that might have been footsteps echoed against what sounded like concrete. "Who is this?" I asked. The breathing stopped. Then, very faintly, I heard my own voice saying, "David Muller, overnight security," as if the words were being played back through a broken speaker. I hung up. My hands shook as I wrote the incident in the logbook. 2:03 a.m., wrong number. No message left. The pen skipped across the page, leaving gaps in the letters like missing teeth. At 2:15 a.m., I started my third patrol. This time, I decided to test the theory that was forming in the back of my mind. Instead of avoiding aisle 19, I walked the perimeter route, but stopped at the intersection of aisles 18 and 20, positioning myself where I could see down both adjacent corridors. Aisle 18, sporting goods, camping equipment, fishing tackle arranged in neat rows. Aisle 20, books, magazines, DVDs organized alphabetically. Aisle 19, cleaning supplies, paper products, and something else. A child stood halfway down the aisle, maybe 8 years old, wearing the yellow raincoat that belonged to a different season. She faced away from me, her small hands pressed against the metal shelving. Her hair hung in wet strands despite the dry air inside the store. I checked my watch. 2:17 a.m., still within the prohibited hours for aisle 19. Rule 6 said to escort any customers to the main entrance immediately. But Rule 3 said to avoid aisle 19 between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. The rules contradicted each other. "Hey," I called out softly. "Store's closed. You need to come with me." The child didn't move, didn't acknowledge my voice at all. I took one step closer. The child's shoulders rose and fell with each breath, but no sound emerged. Her yellow raincoat gleamed under the overhead lights like fresh paint. Another step. The child turned her head slightly. Not enough to see her face, but enough to show that she'd heard me. Water dripped from her hair onto the linoleum floor, forming a puddle that reflected the ceiling fixtures in fractured patterns. "Come on," I said. "I'll take you to your parents." She turned around. The face looking back at me belonged to Jenny, my dead wife, but compressed into the features of a child. Same green eyes, same freckles across the bridge of her nose, same smile that had made me fall in love 8 years ago. But wrong, shrunken, like someone had tried to recreate her from memory and gotten the proportions confused. My breath caught in my throat. The logbook slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a sound like breaking glass. The thing wearing Jenny's face tilted its head and said, "Why didn't you come home that night?" "I waited for you." I backed away from aisle 19, merely tripping over a display of seasonal decorations. When I looked again, the corridor was empty, except for scattered paper towel packages and the growing puddle where the child had stood. The coffee maker clicked on at exactly 2:30 a.m. I found myself in the break room without remembering the walk there, drawn by the familiar sounds of brewing coffee and the promise of caffeine to steady my nerves. The machine was ancient, a Mr. Coffee model from the 1980s, with a cracked carafe and a heating plate stained brown from decades of use. Rule 5. Do not drink the first pot. The coffee smelled wrong as it brewed, not like rust, as Beth had suggested, but like pennies held too long in a sweaty palm, like blood. The dark liquid filled the carafe slowly, each drop adding to a growing pool that looked thicker than it should. I waited, watched the brewing cycle complete. When the machine clicked off, I poured the entire pot down the break room sink and started a fresh batch. The second pot smelled like coffee should, bitter, burnt, comforting. While it brewed, I returned to the security office and reviewed the camera footage from the past hour. Monitor 7 showed nothing unusual in aisle 19. No child in a yellow raincoat. No puddle of water on the floor. Just empty shelving and scattered merchandise. But monitor 12, which covered the intersection where I'd been standing, clearly showed my figure backing away from something in the adjacent aisle. On the recording, I appeared to be talking to empty air, gesturing at nothing, retreating from a threat that didn't exist. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m., matching my watch exactly. I rewound the footage and watched it again. Same result. The camera had recorded my reaction, but not what caused it. At 3 a.m., I'd ventured back to aisle 19. The puddle was gone, but the floor tiles showed water stains in the exact spot where I'd seen the child standing. Dark marks that looked like they'd been there for years, as if something had been dripping on that particular section of linoleum for a very long time. I knelt and touched one of the stains. My finger came away damp. The landline rang. I let it ring 4 times before answering from the extension in the break room where the coffee maker had started another automatic cycle. David Mueller, overnight security. Silence. Then, in Jenny's voice, "You should have been there. Why weren't you there?" The line went dead. I checked the break room clock. 3:04 a.m. According to the rules, aisle 19 was safe now. According to my experience, nothing about this place was safe at all. But I needed this job. I needed the health insurance and the steady paycheck and the routine that might eventually help me sleep through the night without seeing Jenny's Buick wrapped around that oak tree. So I poured another cup of coffee and returned to the monitors, where 42 cameras showed me a store that looked normal and empty and completely ordinary. Until monitor 7 flickered just for a second and showed me that tall figure again. The 4th hour brought a different kind of silence. Not the emptiness I'd grown accustomed to, but something thicker, like the air before a thunderstorm, when even insects stop chirping. I sat in the security office, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee, and watching monitor 7 flicker between normal footage and brief glimpses of that tall figure standing motionless in aisle 19. Each appearance lasted only seconds. Long enough to confirm I wasn't hallucinating, not long enough to study details. The figure never moved, never turned, just stood there like a photograph someone kept sliding across the screen. At 3:23 a.m., I decided to break Rule 7. The nearest emergency exit sat at the back of the store, past electronics and through a corridor lined with employee lockers. The door itself was unremarkable. Gray metal with a push-bar handle and a sign warning that alarms would sound if opened. But according to the rules, I was supposed to check it every hour without ever looking outside. Why would they care what I saw through the door? I approached slowly, coffee cup still in hand. The exit door stood slightly ajar, which violated basic security protocol. A thin line of cold air leaked through the gap, carrying the scent of wet concrete and something else, something organic, like leaves rotting in a ditch. I pushed the door open 6 inches and peered into the parking lot. The scene outside belonged to a different season. Snow covered the asphalt in drifts that reached the wheel wells of abandoned cars. But November in Iowa doesn't usually bring heavy snow, and when I'd arrived for my shift, the parking lot had been dry under clear skies. More troubling were the cars themselves. Dozens of them scattered across the lot in haphazard patterns, as if their drivers had simply stopped wherever they happened to be and walked away. A red Honda sat perpendicular to the painted spaces. A blue pickup truck faced the wrong direction in the fire lane. Near the far edge of the lot, a yellow school bus listed to one side, its emergency flashers still blinking. I recognized one of the vehicles, Jenny's Buick, the same model and color as the car that had wrapped around an oak tree 3 months ago. It sat directly in front of the emergency exit, engine running, headlights cutting twin beams through the falling snow. Someone sat in the driver's seat. I pulled the door wider, stepping halfway outside despite the cold air that bit through my security uniform. Snow crunched under my shoes. Real snow, wet and substantial. The parking lot lights cast everything in amber tones that made the scene feel like an old photograph. The figure in the Buick turned to look at me. Jenny's face, but older. Lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when she died. Gray streaks in her brown hair. She smiled and waved, the same gesture she'd used every morning when I left for work. "David," she called through the windshield. "I've been waiting. Are you ready to come home?" I stepped back inside and slammed the door shut. The lock engaged with a metallic snap that echoed through the empty corridor. When I checked my watch, only 30 seconds had passed since I'd first opened the door. The coffee cup had fallen from my hand at some point, spilling brown liquid across the linoleum floor. I couldn't remember dropping it. Back in the security office, I reviewed the exterior camera feeds. Monitor 15 showed the parking lot as it should be. Empty asphalt under sodium lights, with only my own car parked near the main entrance. No snow, no abandoned vehicles, no yellow school bus with blinking emergency lights. But the timestamp on Monitor 15 was wrong. Instead of 3:24 a.m., it read 12:47 a.m., as if the camera had been recording footage from earlier in the night. I checked the other exterior monitors. Same problem. All of them showed timestamps from before midnight, looping the same hour of empty parking lot over and over. The landline rang. I let it ring 4 times, as specified by Rule 4. "David Muller, overnight security." "You opened the door," Jenny's voice said. "You weren't supposed to do that." "I was checking the lock," I said, though I hadn't planned to engage in conversation. Part of my job. Your job is to follow the rules. The rules keep things separate. They keep what's inside from mixing with what's outside. What's outside? Static filled the line, punctuated by sounds that might have been wind through tree branches or fingers dragging across metal. When Jenny's voice returned, it sounded farther away, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a well. "The night you didn't come home. The night you stayed late at school grading papers while I drove to my sister's house alone. That night is still happening, David. It's always happening. And now you've let it into the store." The line went dead. I stared at the phone for several minutes, processing what she'd said. The night Jenny died, I had stayed late at school. Faculty meeting that ran long, then papers to grade, then reorganizing my classroom because I couldn't face going home to an empty house, while she visited her sister in Waterloo. If I'd left when I'd planned, we would have driven together. She wouldn't have been alone on Highway 218 when the black ice formed. The guilt had been eating at me for 3 months. Apparently, it had followed me to Iowa. At 4 a.m., I began my next patrol. This time I avoided both aisle 19 and the emergency exits. sticking to the main corridors and focusing on areas covered by cameras that seemed to be functioning properly. The store felt different now, larger, as if the act of opening that door had somehow expanded the interior space. In electronics, I found a television turned on despite the power strips being switched off. The screen showed static interrupted by brief images, a yellow raincoat hanging in a child's closet, car headlights reflecting off wet pavement, an empty hospital bed with rumpled sheets. I switched off the TV, but it turned back on as soon as I walked away. In clothing, several mannequins had been repositioned. Instead of facing outward toward potential customers, they all faced inward, toward the center of the store. Their plastic faces wore the same expression, but somehow their eyes seemed to track my movement through the aisles. In groceries, the freezer cases had fogged over from the inside, as if something warm had been breathing on the glass. But when I wiped away the condensation, handprints became visible. Small prints, child-sized, pressed against the interior of the freezer doors. The coffee maker clicked on at 4:30 a.m. This time, I didn't wait for the first pot to finish brewing. I needed answers more than I needed caffeine. The employee break room had a bulletin board covered with safety notices, work schedules, and a faded newspaper clipping that caught my attention. The headline read, "Local security guard missing from department store." The article was dated 23 years ago, but the paper looked fresh, as if someone had cut it from yesterday's Cedar Rapids Gazette. Hi everyone. Before we move forward, I have something exciting to tell you. Many of you asked for stories without the strange rules, so I created a brand new channel just for that. It's called Mr. Grimm Archive. The link is in the description, or you can click the card above. I think you'll really enjoy it. So check it out whenever you want some more exciting types of stories. Also, I hope you're enjoying the 2 uploads a day. Let me know in the comments if you like some stories from your location. Now, let's continue with today's story. According to the story, a man named Thomas Brennan had been working overnight security at the Hawkeye department store when he simply vanished during his shift. Police found no signs of forced entry or struggle. The only unusual detail was that several emergency exits had been found propped open, despite store policy requiring them to remain closed but unlocked. Brennan's replacement had quit after 1 night. His replacement quit after 2 nights. The pattern continued until the store implemented a new set of security protocols, 7 rules that had been in place for exactly 20 years. I was still reading when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing the break room in red light that made everything look like a dark room. The coffee maker continued brewing, its heating element glowing orange in the darkness. From somewhere in the store came the sound of shopping carts rolling across linoleum, dozens of them moving in formation toward an unknown destination. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed the entire store had filled with mobile customers pushing empty carts through darkened aisles. Then, silence. When the main lights returned 30 seconds later, I was alone in the break room with a fresh pot of coffee and the growing certainty that Thomas Brennan hadn't quit, or been fired, or simply walked away. He was still here, somewhere in the store, following the same 7 rules I had been given, waiting for his replacement to make the same mistakes he'd made 23 years ago. The newspaper clipping crumbled to dust between my fingers as I tried to fold it. 23 years of Iowa humidity should have made the paper yellow and brittle, but it had felt fresh until the moment I touched it. Now brown particles scattered across the break room table like ash from a crematorium. I swept the remains into my palm and walked to the wastebasket, but when I opened my hand, nothing fell out. The dust had vanished, leaving only a faint metallic taste in the air that reminded me of old coins. At 4:47 a.m., The landline rang in the security office. 4 rings. Always 4 rings. David Mueller, overnight security. A different voice this time. Male, nervous, with a slight Iowa accent that placed him somewhere between Cedar Rapids and Iowa City. Is this the night shift? Yes. Stores closed until 8 a.m. My name is Thomas Brennan. I used to work your job. Are you following the rules? My coffee cup slipped in my grip, hot liquid splashing across my wrist. You're dead. Missing, he corrected. There's a difference. The rules keep us safe, David. They keep us separate from what comes after midnight, but they only work if you follow them exactly. I opened the emergency door. I know. That's how I can talk to you now. The barriers are thinner when someone breaks Rule 7. Static crackled through the phone line, punctuated by what sounded like footsteps on concrete. Listen carefully. The store exists in multiple times simultaneously. Day shift sees the normal version. Night shift sees what bleeds through from other moments, moments that never ended. Like the night Jenny died. Like every night someone died while wishing they'd made different choices. The store collects them, stores them. But the rules contain them to specific areas and specific hours. I checked monitor 7. Aisle 19 remained empty, but the camera showed a timestamp of 2:17 a.m., the exact time I'd seen the child in the yellow raincoat. How many of us are there? I asked. Enough. We work the same shift in different versions of the same night. Some have been here since the store opened. Others arrived last week. Time doesn't move the same way when you're between what was and what should have been. The phone line filled with interference that sounded like wind through grain fields. When Thomas's voice returned, it carried more urgency. The rules are breaking down. Too many people have worked this job, and too many of them bent the guidelines. Each violation weakens the separation between layers. Soon, day shift will start seeing what we see. What happens then? The store becomes a permanent intersection. Everyone who enters gets pulled into their worst moment and can't leave. The entire building becomes a trap for regret. The line went dead, but I could hear Thomas's footsteps continuing somewhere in the store. Slow, measured steps that echoed from the direction of aisle 19. I left the security office and followed the sound, breaking my own promise to avoid that section during prohibited hours. The timestamp on my watch read 5:03 a.m., which meant aisle 19 should be safe, but I'd learned that time didn't follow normal rules in this place. The corridor appeared normal at first glance. Cleaning supplies, paper towels, toilet paper arranged in neat rows. But as I walked deeper into the aisle, the merchandise began to change. Laundry detergent boxes bore labels written in languages that didn't exist. Bottles of bleach contained liquids that swirled with their own internal light. Price tags showed amounts in currencies I'd never seen, symbols that hurt to look at directly. Thomas stood at the far end of the aisle, wearing a security uniform identical to mine, but faded, as if he'd been washing it in weak detergent for decades. He appeared solid enough, though his shadow fell in the wrong direction under the overhead lights. "You look older than your newspaper photo," I said. 23 years of the same night ages a person. He gestured toward the shelves around us. This aisle is the store's memory. Everything that's ever happened here gets archived in some form. I touched a box of fabric softener. Instead of the familiar texture of cardboard, my fingers encountered something that felt like skin. Warm, yielding, with a pulse beneath the surface. The child with Jenny's face. That was from your worst night too? Different worst night. Mine involved a car accident in 1987. My daughter was in the back seat when a drunk driver ran a red light on First Avenue. Thomas reached toward a bottle of glass cleaner, then thought better of it. I was supposed to pick her up from piano lessons, but I stayed home to watch a Cubs game on television. My wife went instead. And your daughter? 8 years old. Yellow raincoat because it was raining that night. He looked at me with eyes that held decades of accumulated guilt. She appears in this aisle because that's where her raincoat would home if she'd grown up. In the children's section, 2 aisles over. The rules don't just protect us from what's in here. They protect customers during the day from seeing what we've brought with us. Correct. But the system is failing. Last month, a day shift employee found a child's wet handprints on the freezer doors. 2 weeks ago, a customer complained that someone was crying in aisle 19, but when security checked, they found nothing. We walked back toward the main section of the store, our footsteps echoing in rhythm. Thomas moved like someone carrying an invisible weight, shoulders slightly forward, head down. "There's something else," he said as we reached the intersection near electronics. "The rules aren't random safety protocols. They're containment procedures written by someone who understood what this building really is." "Who?" "The original store manager, Edwin Kohler. He disappeared in 1963, 2 years before the Hawkeye department store officially opened. But somehow he managed to write and implement the security guidelines from wherever he ended up. Kohler. Beth Kohler is the current manager. His granddaughter. The family has been trying to fix what he started for 3 generations." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face me. "She didn't hire you by accident, David. Your guilt is particularly strong. It's been calling to the store since the night Jenny died." "Calling to it how?" "Regret creates a specific type of energy. Some places collect it like a battery. The stronger the regret, the more power it provides, and the more it can influence reality around itself." He pointed toward the security office. "That's why the rules exist. They channel the energy into specific containment areas instead of letting it spread throughout the building." "But I broke Rule 7. "Yes. And now your worst night is bleeding into the store's daytime reality. By tomorrow, day shift employees will start seeing Jenny. She'll be standing in cosmetics, or sitting in the break room, or wandering the aisles looking for you." The coffee maker clicked on in the distance, right on schedule. "What happens if I quit?" "You can't. Not anymore. The store won't let you leave until your regret is resolved or contained." Thomas began walking away, his footsteps fading into the ambient sounds of the building. "The rules are the only things keeping any of us sane. Follow them exactly, and you might survive until someone figures out how to fix what Edwin Kohler started." "Wait," I called after him. "How do I resolve regret that can't be changed?" His voice came from somewhere near aisle 19, distant but clear. "You don't. You just learn to carry it without letting it destroy everything around you." I returned to the security office as the clock approached 6 a.m. 3 more hours until day shift arrived. 3 more hours to figure out how to contain the damage I had already done by opening that emergency door. Monitor 7 flickered between different timestamps, showing me glimpses of aisle 19 throughout various moments in the store's history. In some frames, I saw Thomas in his younger security uniform. In others, different people wearing the same uniform, all walking the same patrol routes in different years. But in the most recent frame, dated tomorrow morning at 8:23 a.m., I saw Jenny standing in cosmetics, still wearing the yellow raincoat that belonged to a child who died 23 years ago. She was waiting for the store to open, waiting for day shift employees to arrive and discover what I'd unleashed by breaking the rules. At 6:15 a.m., the store's sound system activated on its own. Static poured from speakers mounted throughout the building, followed by a voice I recognized but couldn't place, elderly, with the careful pronunciation of someone who'd learned English as a second language. "Attention night shift personnel. This is Edwin Kohler, speaking from the administrative offices. Please report to Section C for mandatory safety briefing." I grabbed the two-way radio from my belt and tried to respond, but only dead air crackled back. The PA system continued. "Current containment levels are at 63% and falling. All security personnel must implement Protocol 7 immediately. Failure to comply will result in permanent reassignment." The announcement cut off abruptly, leaving me alone with the hum of ventilation systems and the distant sound of something heavy being dragged across linoleum floors. I checked the monitors. Every screen showed the same timestamp: 6:16 a.m., December 15th, 1963. The cameras revealed a store I didn't recognize. Different layout, older merchandise, employees in uniforms from another era moving through aisles that no longer existed in the current building. On Monitor 7, a younger Edwin Kohler stood in what would eventually become Aisle 19, holding a clipboard and speaking to someone just outside the camera's range. His lips moved, but no sound came through the speakers. Behind him, shadows moved independently of any light source, flowing like spilled oil across the floor. The landline rang. "David Muller, overnight security." "You heard the announcement." Beth Kohler's voice, but strained, as if she were speaking through gritted teeth. "Are you in the security office?" "Yes." "What's Protocol 7? "Emergency lockdown. The barriers between time frames are collapsing faster than we anticipated. My grandfather is trying to stabilize them from his side, but we need your cooperation." "His side of what?" Static filled the line, punctuated by sounds that might have been typing on an old manual typewriter. When Beth's voice returned, it seemed to come from very far away. "Edwin has been managing the store's temporal mechanics since 1963. He's not dead, exactly, but he's not alive in any way we understand. He exists in the administrative space between what was and what is, filing reports on containment breaches and employee infractions that span 6 decades. I looked at Monitor 12, which covered the employee break room. The timestamp read 6:18 a.m., but the image showed the room as it appeared in the 1970s. Different wallpaper, older furniture, a coffee maker that belonged in a museum. A man in a security uniform sat at the table, filling out paperwork with a ballpoint pen. "How many of us are working tonight?" "Currently?" 47 security guards across different time periods. Most don't know about the others. The store compartmentalizes their shifts to prevent confusion. "And Thomas Brennan?" "One of the senior guards. He's been helping us develop new containment protocols since the late 1980s. Beth's voice grew more distant, as if she were walking away from the phone. "Listen carefully, David. The coffee maker in your break room isn't actually a coffee maker. It's a temporal anchor device disguised as ordinary appliances. That's why Rule 5 warns against drinking the first pot. It contains residual energy from previous time periods." I thought about the blood-like consistency of that first pot, the metallic taste that had lingered in the air. What kind of energy? Concentrated guilt. The emotional residue of everyone who's worked your shift since 1963. Drinking it would expose you to decades of accumulated regret, which could drive you insane in minutes. But the second pot is safe. The second cycle filters out the temporal contamination, standard coffee, perfectly drinkable. From somewhere in the store came a sound like metal shopping carts colliding with shelves. The noise grew louder, closer, until it seemed to originate from every direction at once. Then silence. "Beth, what happens if the barriers collapse completely?" The store becomes unstuck in time. Every moment that's ever occurred here happens simultaneously. Customers from 1975 mixing with employees from 1998, mixing with security guards from next week. The entire building becomes a temporal prison where no one can leave because there's no consistent outside to leave to. The call ended with a click that sounded like a door closing. I left the security office and walked towards Section C, following the PA system's instructions, even though every instinct told me to stay hidden until morning. The corridors seemed longer than usual, stretching beyond their normal dimensions. Fluorescent fixtures flickered overhead, some showing the warm light of incandescent bulbs, others casting the harsh white glow of LED strips that hadn't been installed yet. Section C housed aisle 19 and the surrounding departments. As I approached, I could see other figures moving through the aisles. Security guards from different eras wearing variations of the same uniform. Some appeared solid, others flickered like projections. None of them acknowledged my presence. Edwin Kohler stood near the end cap display, where I'd first seen the tall figure on Monitor 7. He looked exactly as he had in the 1963 footage, middle-aged, wearing a suit that belonged to the Eisenhower administration, holding the same clipboard. But his eyes held the accumulated weight of 60 years spent managing something that defied normal comprehension. "Mr. Mueller," he said without looking up from his paperwork. "Thank you for responding to the announcement. I trust you've been following the security protocols?" "Most of them." I opened an emergency door. "Yes, Rule 7 exists because the exterior of the building shows different time periods depending on when you look outside. What you saw was November 15th, 1997, the night your wife would have died if you'd been born 20 years earlier." He made a notation on his clipboard. "Breaking that rule has accelerated the containment failure." Around us, other security guards continued their patrols, walking the same routes through different decades. I recognized Thomas Brennan among them, but also saw guards I hadn't met. Women and men of various ages, all wearing the same expression of weary resignation. "How do we fix this?" "We don't," Edwin said. "We manage it. The store has been collecting temporal anomalies since it opened. Every person who enters carrying sufficient regret becomes an anchor point for their worst moment. The building feeds on that energy and uses it to maintain its existence across multiple time frames." "So this place is alive?" "Not alive. Persistent. It has developed a survival instinct that prioritizes its own continuity over the well-being of individual employees." He flipped a page on his clipboard, revealing forms filled with handwriting from different eras. "The rules exist to channel that persistence into manageable patterns. Think of them as circuit breakers preventing total system overload." I watched a security guard from what appeared to be the 1980s walk through the exact spot where I was standing. We didn't interact physically, but I felt a brief chill as he passed through my position. "What's Protocol 7? Emergency separation of temporal layers. Instead of allowing different time periods to bleed together, we manually isolate each shift to its own timeline." Edwin looked at me for the first time, his eyes reflecting depths that suggested he'd seen far more than any person should. "The process requires voluntary cooperation from all active security personnel." "Voluntary how?" "Each guard must accept permanent assignment to their current time period. No more interactions between shifts, no more glimpses of other eras through the monitors. Complete isolation in exchange for stability. And if we refuse, total collapse within 48 hours. The store becomes a temporal knot that pulls in everyone within a 5-mile radius. Cedar Rapids, Marion, most of Lynn County, all of it gets trapped in a loop of overlapping moments that never resolve, 40,000 people trapped in their worst memories, unable to escape or die or heal. An entire region frozen in perpetual regret. What about day shift? What happens to Beth and the regular employees? They become part of the pattern. Every customer who enters the store gets pulled into their most painful moment and can't leave until they've resolved what can't be resolved. Edwin made another notation. The building grows stronger with each addition. Eventually, it spreads beyond the current location. Other stores, other businesses, entire city blocks become collection points for human suffering. A different security guard approached us, a woman in her 30s wearing a uniform from the 1990s. She nodded to Edwin and handed him a report, written on forms I didn't recognize. Containment holding in sections D through F, she said, but we're losing stability in electronics. The televisions are showing broadcasts from next Tuesday. Thank you, Patricia. Continue monitoring. Edwin turned back to me. Time is accelerating, Mr. Mueller. We need your decision within the next 30 minutes. What decision? Accept permanent assignment to the November 15th timeline, or watch everything you've ever known dissolve into temporal chaos. He checked an old Timex watch that probably hadn't been manufactured since before I was born. Your shift ends at 8 a.m., but if you choose Protocol 7, this shift becomes your entire existence, forever. And Jenny? What happens to her? She remains contained within the store's memory systems. You'll see her occasionally, in reflections, on security monitors, during moments when the barrier's thin. But she won't be able to interact with the outside world. Edwin's expression softened slightly. It's not ideal, but it's better than watching her regret consume everyone in a 100-mile radius. I looked around Section C, watching security guards from 6 decades patrol the same aisles in their own isolated time periods. All of them had made the same choice I was being asked to make. All of them had traded their lives for the safety of people who would never know the sacrifice had been necessary. The coffee maker clicked on in the distance, brewing another pot for another security guard in another timeline, maintaining the same schedule it had kept for decades. At 7:23 a.m., I gave Edwin Kaler my answer. So this will happen again? Eventually. Maybe in 5 years, maybe in 20. Someone else will take a security job they desperately need, and they'll bring their own regret into the building. Beth's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd inherited an impossible problem. My grandfather has been working on a permanent solution for 60 years. So far, no luck. I looked at Monitor 7, which showed aisle 19 in normal lighting with ordinary cleaning supplies. No tall figures, no children in raincoats, no puddles of water that shouldn't exist. What happens to Jenny now? She's still here, but contained within your timeline. You'll see her occasionally, reflections in the cosmetics mirrors, walking through aisles during your patrols, sitting in the break room during your coffee breaks. But she can't reach beyond the store's boundaries. Can I talk to her? Yes, but be careful. She's not the Jenny you remember. She's a projection of your guilt, which means she'll only tell you things you already believe about yourself. Mostly painful things. The coffee maker clicked on automatically, right on schedule. I walked to the break room and poured myself a cup from the second pot, following Rule 5 even though I now understood the science behind it. The coffee tasted like coffee should. Bitter, warm, familiar. Jenny sat at the table across from me, still wearing the clothes she'd dyed in 3 months ago. Blue jeans, Iowa Hawkeyes sweatshirt, the silver bracelet I'd given her for our anniversary. She looked exactly as I remembered, except for her eyes. They held an awareness that belonged to someone who'd spent time in the spaces between life and death. "You're not coming home," she said. It wasn't a question. I can't. This is home now. Because of what happened to me. Because of what I didn't do. I should have driven with you that night. Should have left school when I planned instead of staying late to avoid an empty house. Jenny reached across the table and touched my hand. Her fingers felt cold but solid, real enough to provide comfort. "Do you remember what I told you the first time we talked about having children?" I did remember. We'd been walking along the Winnebago River after dinner at our favorite restaurant in Cedar Falls. She'd said that the best parents weren't the ones who never made mistakes, but the ones who learned to live with their mistakes without letting the guilt destroy the people they loved. I remember. This job, this choice you made, it's not penance, David. It's just work that needs doing. She squeezed my hand gently. I'm not angry that you stayed late that night. I'm grateful you found a way to help people, even if they'll never know you helped them. But you're still dead. Yes, that won't change no matter how much guilt you carry. She stood and walked toward the break room door. But the living don't have to be trapped by the dead. Not unless they choose to be. At 7:58 a.m., I heard keys rattling in the main entrance. Day shift arriving early, probably Beth coming to check on the aftermath of Protocol 7. I walked to the security office and began shutting down the monitors, following the end-of-shift procedures I'd never gotten to complete during my first night. The landline rang one last time. David Mueller, overnight security. "This is Thomas Brennan. Just wanted to say welcome to the team. How does this work now? Do we ever see each other again?" "Occasionally. During containment breaches or equipment failures, the barrier's thin enough for limited contact. But mostly we work alone, in our own time periods, following the same rules." Thomas's voice carried the acceptance of someone who'd had 23 years to adjust to the situation. "It's not a bad life, David. Quiet, predictable, meaningful in its own way. And the coffee's not terrible once you get used to it. Any advice for the new guy? Follow the rules. All of them, exactly as written. They're not suggestions. They're survival protocols developed through decades of trial and error. And remember that you're not serving a sentence. You're doing work that matters." The call ended as Beth knocked on the main entrance. Through the glass, I could see her holding a clipboard and wearing the same style of clothing she'd worn during my interview. But something in her expression had changed. She looked older, more tired, as if the night's events had aged her several years in the span of a few hours. I unlocked the door and let her in. "How do you feel?" she asked, studying my face carefully. "Different. Like I've been stretched and then compressed back into my original shape." I handed her the keys and the laminated rule card. "Do I get to keep these?" "You'll need them. Your shift starts again at 10 p.m. tonight." Beth made a note on her clipboard. "The isolation protocol creates a 22-hour loop for each security guard. You work from 10 to 8, then experience the same 14-hour period outside of work over and over. Different details, different conversations, but essentially the same day. Forever? Until we find a permanent solution, or the store's energy source runs out." She looked around the empty building, checking for any signs of the supernatural chaos that had nearly consumed the entire region. But given how much guilt humanity produces on a daily basis, that could take several centuries. I walked outside into the November morning, breathing cold Iowa air that tasted like approaching snow. The parking lot appeared normal, empty except for Beth's car and my own vehicle. No abandoned automobiles, no supernatural weather patterns, no signs that reality had nearly collapsed 12 hours earlier. But I knew I'd be back in 14 hours to start the same shift again, and again, and again, for as long as it took to keep the dead from destroying the living. The loops began that same night. At 9:47 p.m., I walked through the main entrance of Hawkeye department store for the second time, carrying the same coffee and wearing the same uniform. Beth handed me the keys and clipboard, delivered the same orientation speech, and left me alone with the 7 rules that had become as familiar as breathing. But small details changed with each iteration. Sometimes Beth wore a different colored blouse. Sometimes the coffee machine in the break room displayed a different time on its digital clock. Sometimes the newspaper clipping about Thomas Brannan appeared in different locations, taped to the employee bulletin board, tucked between cleaning supplies in aisle 19, folded inside my security manual. By my 10th loop, I had memorized every camera angle, every shadow pattern, every sound the building made during its overnight cycle. The store became as predictable as sheet music, and I learned to conduct its nightly symphony of creaks, hums, and electronic chirps with practiced precision. Jenny appeared regularly during these shifts, though never in exactly the same way twice. Sometimes she sat in the break room, drinking coffee that steamed despite being poured from an empty pot. Sometimes I glimpsed her reflection in the cosmetics mirrors, standing behind displays of lipstick and foundation that hadn't existed during her lifetime. Once she walked past the security office windows, wearing a store employee uniform and carrying a clipboard identical to mine. "You're getting used to this place," she observed during my 15th loop, materializing in the chair across from my desk while I monitored the overnight footage. "It's become routine," I admitted, "like teaching the same lesson plan for multiple semesters." "Do you miss the outside world?" I considered the question seriously. During each 14-hour break between shifts, I experienced the same day repeatedly. November 16th, 2024. I woke in the same motel room Beth had arranged for me, ate breakfast at the same diner, watched the same news broadcasts about local politics and high school football scores. The repetition should have driven me crazy, but instead it provided a strange comfort. "I miss the possibility of surprise," I said, "but I don't miss the uncertainty." Jenny nodded as if she understood. "Time moves differently when you know exactly what's going to happen. It becomes less about duration and more about depth." She was right. Each loop allowed me to notice details I'd missed before. The way certain fluorescent bulbs flickered in patterns that resembled Morse code. The fact that aisle 19's cleaning supplies were always arranged in groups of 7, matching the number of security rules. The soft clicking sound that came from the employee break room every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., even when the coffee maker wasn't brewing. During my 21st loop, I discovered what caused the clicking. The sound originated from an old manual typewriter hidden in a storage closet behind the break room. Every night at 3:17 a.m., the typewriter activated itself and typed a single-page report, which then vanished into thin air as soon as the keys stopped moving. I managed to read one of these reports before it disappeared. Incident report number 7847. Date November 15th, 2024. Iteration 21. Security personnel. D. Mueller timeline. Stability. 94.7%, within acceptable parameters. Emotional resonance levels. Moderate containment. Status. Holding supervisor. Notes. Subject adapting well to loop structure. Guilt processing ahead of schedule. Recommend continued monitoring. Filed by E. Kohler, Administrative Services. Edwin was still watching us, still filing reports on our psychological states and contained inefficiency. The realization should have felt invasive, but instead it provided reassurance. Someone was keeping track, making sure the system functioned properly. During my 30th loop, I began experimenting with the rules themselves. I discovered that Rule 2, testing fire alarms in specific sections, served a purpose beyond safety verification. Each alarm test sent out a pulse that recalibrated the temporal barriers between different time periods. Section A stabilized the 1960s through 1980s. Section D maintained the 1980s through the 2000s. Section G anchored 2000s through present day. Section C, which contained aisle 19, wasn't tested because it served as a neutral zone where different timelines could safely interface. That's why supernatural encounters always occurred there. It was the only area where past and present could interact without causing system-wide contamination. Rule 4's requirement to answer the phone only after 4 rings wasn't arbitrary politeness. The delay allowed the store's communication system to filter incoming calls through temporal buffers, ensuring that conversations occurred in the correct timeline. Answering too early could result in speaking to someone from a different decade entirely. Rule 6's instruction to escort customers immediately to the exit reflected the danger of allowing day-world people to linger in a space saturated with supernatural energy. The longer someone stayed inside after hours, the greater the chance they'd become anchored to their own worst memories and unable to leave. The most complex rule was number 7. Emergency exits had to remain unlocked from the inside, but never opened to look outside because the exterior of the building existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. Opening those doors allowed different eras to bleed into each other, creating the contamination that had nearly caused total system collapse during my first shift. By my 40th loop, I had become skilled enough to help other security guards during temporal emergencies. The first crisis occurred when a guard from 1982, a woman named Carol whose daughter had been killed by a drunk driver, experienced what Edwin called a resonance cascade. Her grief had intensified beyond containment levels, causing her timeline to bleed into adjacent decades and threatening to unravel the entire isolation system. I received the emergency call at 2:34 a.m. "David, this is Thomas. We need assistance with a Code 7 situation in the 1982 timeline. Can you provide temporal anchor support?" The process involved standing in specific locations throughout the store. While reciting stabilization protocols, Edwin had taught me through a series of typed notes that appeared in my security manual. By focusing on my own contained guilt about Jenny's death, I could provide emotional ballast that helped prevent Carol's sorrow from destabilizing the temporal barriers. We saved the system, but Carol had to be permanently transferred to a deeper isolation level where her timeline couldn't interact with any others. She became a legend among the security staff, a cautionary tale about the importance of processing grief in manageable increments rather than allowing it to accumulate beyond safe levels. During my 50th loop, I received my first supervisory assignment. "Mr. Muller," Edwin's voice crackled through the PA system at the beginning of my shift. "Please report to Section C for briefing on new personnel integration." A recent hire had started that night. A young man named Kevin Patterson, whose wife had died in a farming accident near Ames. He carried the same desperate need for employment and the same crushing guilt that had brought me to the store 2 months earlier. My job was to monitor his first few shifts through the security cameras, document his adjustment to the supernatural elements, and provide guidance during his inevitable rule violations. Every new guard broke at least one rule during their initial training period. The key was minimizing the damage while helping them understand why the protocols existed. Kevin lasted 6 loops before opening an emergency door to check on strange lights in the parking lot. I was ready with containment procedures, helping him process the temporal vertigo and explaining the relationship between guilt and supernatural manifestation. "This is permanent, isn't it?" he asked during his 7th loop, sitting in the break room while Jenny poured coffee that smelled like rain-soaked earth. Yes, I told him, but it's also important. We're protecting people who have no idea they need protection. How do you live with that? I thought about the question seriously. How did any of us live with the knowledge that we'd traded our freedom to prevent a supernatural catastrophe? How did we find meaning in repetitive shifts that would continue for decades or centuries? You find purpose in small things, I said, perfect compliance with the rules, helping newer guards adjust, learning more about how the system works. Eventually, you realize that this isn't punishment, it's craftsmanship. We're artisans of temporal stability. Kevin nodded slowly, beginning to understand what I had learned over 50 iterations of the same night. The job wasn't about serving time for past mistakes. It was about using those mistakes to develop expertise in preventing future disasters. By my 60th loop, I had been promoted to senior security supervisor, responsible for coordinating between multiple timelines and training new personnel. The store had become my home, my profession, and my calling. And somewhere in the administrative spaces between what was and what might have been, Edwin Kohler continued filing reports on our progress, documenting our transformation from guilt-ridden individuals into skilled professionals who maintain the barriers between different versions of reality. The work never ended, but it no longer felt like imprisonment. It felt like purpose. The 100th loop began like all the others, but I noticed details that had escaped me during previous iterations. The way dust motes danced in the security office's fluorescent glow formed patterns that resembled musical notation. The coffee maker's brewing cycle synchronized perfectly with the building's ventilation system, creating a rhythm that matched my heartbeat during moments of complete relaxation. These weren't signs of madness or temporal displacement. They were evidence of mastery, the ability to find infinite complexity within finite boundaries. My desk now held a collection of items that appeared and disappeared according to schedules I'd learned to predict. Edwin's typed reports materialized every Tuesday. Thomas left hand-drawn maps of temporal weak points every Friday. Patricia from the 1990s somehow managed to deliver fresh cookies that tasted like they'd been baked in 1994, complete with the slightly burnt edges that suggested an oven calibrated for a different decade. Tonight, a new folder sat beside my coffee cup. Inside, I found a personnel file for someone named Rebecca Chen, a literature professor from Iowa City whose husband had died in a motorcycle accident last spring. Her application for overnight security work would be processed tomorrow, during the daylight hours I no longer directly experienced. The pattern continued. People carrying unbearable guilt found their way to jobs they desperately needed, never suspecting they'd been recruited by supernatural forces that fed on human regret. The store's hunger remained constant, but under careful management, that hunger served a protective function rather than a destructive one. My radio crackled with an incoming transmission. "David, this is Edwin. Please meet me in Section C. We have a situation that requires senior expertise." I found him standing near the exact spot where I'd first accepted Protocol 7, holding a clipboard that contained forms written in languages from time periods that hadn't occurred yet. His suit showed signs of 60 years' worth of administrative work, coffee stains from decades of overnight meetings, wear patterns from countless presentations to security personnel who existed in different centuries. "Mr. Mueller, I have an unusual request," he said without preamble. "Corporate has approved expansion of our containment model to other locations. We need experienced supervisors to establish protocols at similar facilities in Waterloo, Dubuque, and Des Moines. Similar facilities, department stores, shopping centers, large retail spaces where people spend money while carrying emotional burdens. These locations naturally accumulate temporal energy, but without proper management, they become unstable. Edwin flipped through several pages of documentation. Would you consider accepting a transfer to help establish operations elsewhere? The question surprised me. After 100 loops of the same shift in the same building, the possibility of change felt both exciting and terrifying. What about this location? Thomas has agreed to assume senior supervisory duties. He's been preparing for promotion since the late 1980s. Edwin made a notation with a pen that looked like it had been manufactured during the Truman administration. The choice is yours, of course. You've earned the right to remain here permanently if you prefer routine over responsibility. I walked to Monitor 7 and looked at aisle 19, now as familiar as my own reflection. Every shelf, every product, every shadow held memories of supernatural encounters that had taught me skills I'd never expected to need. This place had become home in ways that transcended normal definitions of residence. But Edwin was right about responsibility. Other people in other places were experiencing the same crushing guilt that had brought me here. Other retail locations were collecting temporal energy without proper containment. Other tragedies were waiting to occur, unless someone with experience prevented them. Jenny appeared beside me, wearing the store employee uniform she'd adopted during recent loops. She looked proud rather than sad, which represented significant progress from our early conversations. "What do you think?" I asked her. "I think you've learned to transform guilt into purpose," she said. "Now you have the chance to help other people do the same thing." I returned to Edwin and gave him my decision. Within minutes, the familiar routine of Hawkeye department store began to fade. The walls became transparent, revealing corridors that led to other buildings in other cities where people carrying unbearable regrets would find jobs they desperately needed. The work continued, but the location expanded. Instead of managing one store's temporal stability, I would help establish an entire network of containment facilities throughout Iowa, each one serving as a sanctuary for guilt that might otherwise consume entire communities. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I started teaching high school history, but it was meaningful work that protected people who would never know they'd been in danger, performed by professionals who'd learned to find satisfaction in repetitive tasks that prevented supernatural disasters. The coffee always tasted better when you understood its purpose. The rules always made sense when you grasped the consequences of breaking them. And the isolation never felt lonely when you knew other people depended on your expertise to maintain the barriers between what was and what should never be. As I walked toward my new assignment, I heard the familiar sound of shopping carts rolling through empty aisles, carrying invisible cargo through temporal spaces that existed between heartbeats. The work never ended, but neither did the opportunity to help people transform their worst moments into something that protected everyone else from experiencing the same pain. That was enough purpose for several lifetimes.